Okay. My name is Justin Fleming. I am now 27. I live in the greater Metro Detroit area, one of the suburbs outside of Detroit. Not too far from it, though. I first heard about Don't Die through Twitter. I have a friend. They've pretty much always worked in a lot of different PR and English working stuff, and she retweeted one of your earliest interviews. I want to say was with an anonymous lapsed gamer, and I read that whole interview, and I found it really interesting because it really was just this immediate perspective of somebody who wasn't playing video games anymore, and this was pretty hot off the heels of Gamergate, and so that perspective was interesting. And then I kept reading the articles and the other interviews on there, and they were a lot more illuminating to things that I was interested in surrounding video games. They had more answers that really weren't out there at the time. So I got in touch with you in 2016 around the summertime, I want to say, and we set up a conversation. And at first, it seems like we were kind of interested in talking about video game journalism or writing for media, and it kind of did go in that direction. But it wasn't maybe necessarily what we thought it was. At first, you thought I was interested in actually still writing for journalism, and really what I wanted to talk about and what we kind of just discussed and pursued was how games media is not like everywhere else when it comes to writing for media or when it comes to writing in journalism. And now we're here.
Here we are.
So now you've asked me to kind of talk to you, get your brain rolling again now that you're doing some of these interviews again after doing a lot of work elsewhere, essentially. And before I do have questions, you mentioned you were kind of interested to see what previous questions were that we had before and what they come off of as now. And that's good because I did write down a few questions, ones that I feel like I didn't answer quite so clearly before. So I think there'll definitely be something there. But before we get there, I wanted to kind of start at the thing that you're probably most recently familiar with and work towards media writing and video games. So first, I just have questions generally about writing.
Okay.
And so I was just curious, when did writing really start for you? Did something really compel you to write, and when did that eventually move into video games?
That's a good question. So I'll just say please hold me to the fire to make sure that I actually answer your questions and don't just sort of tangentialize or just go off and talk and explore some adjacent area of thought. I want to make sure I do answer your questions, and if I wind up doing that, I'm not intentionally trying to run away from anything. It's just sort of the way that I talk and the way that I think, which is that I've been told that I think out loud, which makes me very well suited, I think, to doing interviews and really just going with other people on where they're going. And whereas I'm less interested in did we answer my question? Because I'm not even sure that my questions, I always joke on this, they don't really have answers, they more have responses. And I sort of had anticipated being asked about writing, and I don't know why. I don't know if it's because I remember in our threads
been doing it for a while.
Well, but even I feel weird about that because it's I've been doing interviews, and I just wrote a book, but the book is similar to all these interviews where it's all other people's words, and I just sort of anticipated that we were going to talk about this because I knew this was some of the first stuff that we had talked about. And in my head, it may sound dumb, or it may sound conceited, or it may sound like a humble brag. It may sound like a thing, but this is just actually the truth and my truth, which is I don't even think I really realized that I had a knack for writing until 6-7 years ago, which would have been in my late 20s now. I'm 36 now, when I was not that when I started this. So, sort of like you, it's interesting to go in a couple of years and just see what is different about me? What is different about you? And, I grew up in a house where, my dad was a newspaper man, which is sort of a word you don't really hear anymore. But my mom was a librarian, and she had wanted to be a teacher before. So I come from a very, brainy, I guess,
Yeah.
sort of upbringing, or sort of a very in our head kind of upbringing. Mm-hmm. And I have an older brother, and he also is a good writer, a talented writer. And so, I think when you grow up in that background or in that context, it doesn't even really sink into you that like you have like extra points in this particular skill tree that maybe other people don't, that they have other specialties that you don't necessarily, or other strengths that you don't have necessarily. Yeah. And I can remember like, just always drawing growing up, always writing, painting, sometimes doing collages, playing music. Like I've always sort of just been self-expressive, I guess. Okay. I can remember one time in high school, I got in trouble with my U.S. history teacher, or Western Civ teacher, one of those classes. I think it was U.S. history, and I want to say I was like a junior or a senior in high school. And my teacher, I want to say Mr. Horst was his name. There was a thing at the top of the paper that said, "Please see me," and I said, "Uh-oh," because I was always like like a real good student in school, if not straight A's, then occasional B's. I think I got my first C in college, and it was not really a college. I really did not have some sort of breakdown or anything by it. I was just like, yeah, well, that's kind of the point of college, is to challenge yourself, right? And so, I came and saw the teacher, and I was like, oh, what is this about? And he basically was like, well, he was accusing me of plagiarism. He's like, I know that you copied this out of an encyclopedia or something. This is how long ago this was. There was no Wikipedia. It was probably Encarta and the World Book is what I had. And, I don't really remember any sort of like further thing with like my parents getting involved. I can just remember that like a subsequent paper, maybe even my next one, like he apologized to me, like the teacher was like, oh, I'm sorry, you actually do just have an aptitude for writing. But I don't know why it never really sank into me between then and, 6 or so years ago, that I was like, oh, I'm actually like fairly good at this. But I never really thought about like pursuing writing. Like, the thing about, it's just weird. Because like it's sort of the cliche, and I guess these are cliches because they're typically true, but like I really didn't set out to become a writer. As I mentioned, I sort of like
found you.
What's that?
It found you.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the thing. Like, and so like when I was in college, like I was studying music business, and I was, it's all so intertwined, like just the way that life works and the way that you think like, well, this is not probably a direction I'm thinking of going in, or, like in college, like, which I just really struggled with like committing to going. And I'm generally the kind of person who just commits in a direction and goes with it. But I just, at that point, had really struggled with like, well, are you supposed to just go to college and know who you're supposed to be the rest of your life? And so I did like a term on and a term off and a term on and then a term off. And then when I finally was like, all right, I better just buckle down and just actually do this, I picked a school in, I guess it's technically the Deep South, although people I know in the South sort of scoff at calling anything in Tennessee the Deep South. But I went and studied music business instead of journalism. I think because even at that point, which would have been early 2000s, I had already sort of started to see that industry sort of begin the hollowing out process that was happening, just because of stuff that was happening in my dad's office or with my dad's friends, just sort of, budgets starting to tighten. I don't even think Craigslist was as much of a thing, which is sort of like one of the big precipitating downfalls of online journalism, it cannibalizing the classified sections. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Just a lot of, lost ad revenue. But so like I wound up studying music business because, as I mentioned, like I had a lot of different interests and I had been in bands, and I thought, well, it's probably not a sure bet. It's probably not a sure bet to go into journalism when I am a grown up, and I'm not at that point. I didn't even really think it was like a strong skill of mine or anything that was special about me. I was like, I'll study music business because I'm just, I'm interested, and I just sort of approached it as an academic exercise. And so the irony is, of course, just my trying to be informed and react to what I had seen going on in journalism was I wound up studying music business while all the Napster stuff was happening. And so it started to crystallize in my head at that point. I was like, gee, maybe this isn't really quite the business that I should be going into. But I don't know. I don't know now, in my 30s, if like you can really bet on being in an industry that isn't going through some sort of really tumultuous change. It's it's the nature of the universe, but also like you just can't predict, and so you don't really want to be in a position where you don't bet on any horse. But I just never could have predicted that, going out of my way to go to school for anything but would lead to my taking a single entertainment reporting and writing class, and that leading to an internship at Rolling Stone, and then at that point, my having the this is true, my having the audacity to tell my future boss at Rolling Stone, after he had offered me an internship, I told him I would have to think about it, and could I get back to him? I don't really know what that was all about, and even my coming to Don't Die came out of a period of my sort of trying to get out of writing for the internet, just because it's been well documented, like it's really tough to make a go of, and even if you're lucky, it's really hard to support yourself. And I'm not so interested in like griping or complaining about those things. I'm happy to talk about those things. I just think they're fairly well known. But it's just funny. As I say this all out and explain, it's sort of like once I get out, they pull me back in.
Yeah, or it almost seems like something makes you curious, and it seems like you've always been willing to chase that curiosity as far as you can take it.
Yeah, I think so, and I think I don't know if this really answers your question, or if it goes too fast into the present or the recent past, but sort of my wanting to start Don't Die came out of a reaction of just like my sort of impatience with like sort of waiting for permission to explore certain through lines, and not wanting. I mean, I don't want to get ahead of myself or ahead of your questions.
Sure, no, I can relate to that though. One of my old friends, kind of a mentor guy, he had one of his specific like attitudes towards a lot of people on the internet who want to have ideas. He's like, everybody's got ideas. And the difference is, between people having ideas and people just saying, nah, screw it, I'm going to go do it.
Yeah.
And I think for some people you can't. For some people, like, eventually come to that realization that, like, you can wait around forever for a group of people to want to execute on an idea instead of just postulating about it. You can sit around, like, I've had so many times where people are like, oh, let's make a podcast. But really, you need people who are willing to do something and just go do it.
Yeah.
Let's see. What was my next? I was kind of thinking about, so I was going through these questions and trying to come up with some of the stuff, and I wondered if at some point, if this was just like a general writing thought, is like just trying to think about writing and how it's different from a lot of different forms of art or a form of something you present or entertainment. And I wondered, like, can you think of a time or experience where writing is a actual performance instead of a presented art? Like, I can't think of too many scenarios where you go up on stage and you are writing something live in a way that's entertaining to people. You can only like tell the story if you're Mark Twain. You don't get to like write it, and that's something that's entertaining. Have you like ever seen something of that in that line?
Well, isn't that social media?
I guess.
I'm not trying to be glib. I mean, that's a whole other area, but I don't know, because I don't want to be cutesy about it, because I owe, especially through the lens of Don't Die, like I owe a great deal to social media, but I know how frustrating it is and can be for many people, and I think that a lot of the frustrations that people, what they're speaking to or what they're reacting to is this sort of perceived performance aspect to a lot of what they're seeing, whether it's from people in their immediate circles or adjacent to their immediate circles or far outside. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's sort of one of the big problems with, I think, writing in general is so much is dependent on, if I'm writing a thing, so much is dependent upon my ability to clearly articulate and be thoughtful of all the possible ways that what I'm writing, like the ways that it can be misunderstood, the ways that it can be intentionally misunderstood, the ways that like certain biases might be showing, the way that certain biases might be not even realized. I think it's sort of a two-way street. I don't think that things that are performance are bad. I think that that sort of is like it's sort of been this thing that has sort of eroded our feeling like we can trust and understand each other through technology. It's just all that cloud of suspicion in seeing a byline alone or seeing a writer's picture next to their piece, like seeing the headline. Like there's so many aspects to it that I suppose even like reading in a certain perspective is sort of performative in a way. But, and I feel like I've said this elsewhere on here at some point. I don't really want to repeat myself, but like, it's like the problem with like glossing over believing everything without realizing we're believing everything is just how many buttons we allow to be pushed in our brains and sort of the ways that we react without even realizing what we're reacting to. It's like, I could tweet something, but for all you know, a friend of mine grabbed my phone and tweeted something, and I didn't even know that it was out there. Yeah. Or, a piece that could have... I don't want to use myself as an example on all this because it's going to make it seem like these are things that I do or have happened. But it's like, just because someone's byline is up, it could be a ghost-written thing. There's just, it's like that age-old thing about the internet. I don't know if you've ever heard it, but it just like, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. That was the thing they used to say, and I think that
that eventually changed to, was it all girls on the internet are dudes? Like, you don't know, right? A girl on the internet stood for guy in real life as an acronym.
That must
for a little while.
That must be true.
I kind of like I can see that. Like in some ways, I can see like social media can't be in some ways more than a rap battle if it's going to be some sort of a performative writing, like because it's not people, and I'm not trying to like put writing above any other form of expression or anything, but I really do think that like writing is something that requires you to sit down and requires you to think about what you're going to say, or I think like most forms of it are going to do that, and if it's not having you sit down and require that you think about what you're saying and how it's going to come across to other people, then it may not be what writing really is about.
I mean, it sounds so snobby, and maybe I should just stop saying that and just look at myself and think maybe it's okay to be snobby in this way, or maybe to say, gee, maybe you're just a snob, but like
maybe you're just a slob if I'm a snob.
Oh, maybe. But like, I don't know if I've said this to you. I definitely know I say this to my friends every once in a while, which is like, I really, if I can help it, I try not to read articles online. Like I mainly read books. And I guess I don't know. I don't really know if that is snobby or not, but I just feel like it's a way to guarantee the stuff that you're reading has had a certain measure of thought and consideration and scrutiny put into it.
Sure.
The internet is great, and I do believe that, but how many record reviews have there been where, I don't know, this is such a dated example, but like the one that I remember is like, Pitchfork reviewed, a Neutral Milk Hotel record, and they totally panned it. And then as years went on, and that particular album was hailed as like a cult classic, they went back and gave it like a 10.0 review and got rid of the old review. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to make it seem like the internet is just a tool for paranoia, but I think that feeling is very much in the air now.
Yeah.
Anyway, and I don't think that necessarily is something inherently about the internet. The common denominator to the internet and to writing, although a lot of computers are now also doing writing, is that humans are doing it, and I guess computers also perform. So I don't know. It's an interesting question about when can writing be a performance?
Computers performing, that's a thought.
Well, yeah. I mean, you would know better than I with your interest in electronic music.
Yeah. It's just one of those things where I think about it, and it's there are ways in which I'm only going to go on this briefly, but there's ways in which the human equation can be or has been, in some scenarios, slightly eliminated from that. I know there's a playlist that was put on Spotify of pre-selected songs, and those songs would actually mix into each other utilizing things other than just crossfade in terms of music.
Yeah.
So it was actually trying to DJ. Spotify was built to DJ this playlist and nothing else, but it's one of those things. I've never really thought about that, but it's true. That technically would be performance.
Yeah.
I did mention that some of the questions before that, I answered in ways that I don't think were too clear. And it's mainly just one, which is you asked me on our last talk, you asked me what do good writers say about video games, and I didn't really have the best answer. I think I gave a lot of I'm not sure, and then we started questioning how much of the writing isn't just coverage and trying to hype up these products. And I realize now that back then I just wasn't really looking in the right places or wasn't looking for the right answer. And now I've definitely got at least three different suggestions that I can say. One of which I think I found out through a connection through you. It's this online magazine. It's called Heterotopias.
Oh right.
It's this wonderful every few months it's a breakdown of literal spaces in video games and how architectural ideas are relayed into the video game sense. The three different really cool ones were, there's one that looks at various bathrooms across all of video game history, because so many video games have bathrooms and what they say about the video game. There's one that is discussing Kentucky Route Zero and how it uses its camera to illuminate things about the characters in combination with the buildings. And there's a third one that talks about the imagery and spaces of Life is Strange as explorations of female adolescence, how each space kind of reflects something about that. And if it's not that, there's other really good writers talking about video games. There's a lot of video game developers and designers have blogs where they write about their own experiences with video games. Jonathan Blow talks about what he learns. Frictional Games typically talks about their experiences with what their games teach them about horror in video games and narrative. There's tons of developers. I bet a dime a dozen you could find a developer and be like, what's your opinions on Far Cry 2? And there's an article somewhere, because that's most developers have a lot of things to say about that. Yeah. And then the third one I wanted to fix my previous question was there's this YouTube channel, it's called Errant Signal. Normally he looks at design stuff, but recently he started to want to be a champion of covering video games that most people will never play. The stuff that's out on itch.io, not on Steam, the stuff that's not on any of the major platforms. And he wants to show how there's a little bit of value in a lot of them out there. It's I realize now after 3 years that the stuff is definitely out there, and it typically seems to be growing thanks to the works of the people who often make the same products. The people who make this art are also the people really talking about it, looking at what works and what doesn't, or sometimes just relating it to how it connects to humans.
Yeah, it's hard. That was sort of, I think the other question you asked in the beginning was sort of how did I start writing about video games? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, I knew there was something I didn't mention, but I can actually connect that here.
Sure.
So, sort of despite myself, DESPITE, not to spite myself.
Yes.
So I basically landed this internship at Rolling Stone, and it was cool, and it was a very valuable experience because it sort of was the only thing on my resume, and I got clips out of it. I had written some stuff for Rolling Stone in 2005, so like I walked away from that experience with and I had to go back and finish up my degree that fall of 2005. So coming into 2006, I had just finished my bachelor's and had a resume that demonstrated like I have proven writing ability, and I think I tried to go in a number of different directions. I also like worked for the NPR affiliate I was also on campus. It was a jazz station. I was on-air talent, announcing jazz artists. There were a lot of different directions that I felt like I could go in, and it just happened that I landed a couple of different internships at the same time, and I was very lucky in that regard to be able to work for free for a time, because it actually sort of helped my resume even further make a little bit more sense, rather than I graduated high school, I graduated college, and I have some experience, and I started as an intern at the Onion AV Club. And this is sort of like a recurring thing throughout my career, just sort of like being at a media place at a time when there's sort of reckoning with like, well, what are we supposed to do with our website? Which for a young writer means a lot of opportunities to sort of write a lot. And in my case at the Onion, it also sort of created a new opening at the bottom of management to become an editor, which I did, as I took my boss's job and he took his boss's job, and my boss's boss took his boss's 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 job.
Everyone went up one.
And I went up from not getting paid to getting a salary, and sort of parallel to my work covering the arts and entertainment scene in Chicago. It's funny because I think it's maybe a little over a decade at this point now. And very much, it's funny because the thing that you said that you went through in the last 3 years is sort of seeing different types of coverage. There was very little, if almost none. I feel like, don't quote me on that, but this is going to go out verbatim, so that's fine. A lot of the sort of coverage, or the places that like sort of off the radar, under the radar games were being talked about, were like on message boards, like NeoGAF or a couple others that are still around, and a lot that are not. And so like you would never really see them because there weren't as many places to get paid to write about games. There were a lot of websites, but they had a very specific approach from a more enthusiast perspective and mindset, which is totally fine. It's just, it makes a lot of assumptions about the readers, which is just that they have a very intimate and passionate knowledge of games and are not turned off to, certain, a lot of jargon being used, a lot of references to things not being explained. Whereas the Onion AV Club was always positioned as like for a savvier, geeky nerd, I guess is fine. Sure. And they had coverage of movies, TV, books, film, theater, restaurants, books, pretty much everything you could spend your time on, but really not much on video games. And I had sort of just elected to voluntarily, with a couple other people, although I think I was the only staffer at that point, to sort of help conjure and create, like, hey, there should be a game section. We should be covering games. And so I was just voluntarily, reviewing games, and I think that was how I attended my first game developers conference. That was how I, for the first time ever, attended E3. and covered them. And it was a real interesting time because it was before there were things like Vice having a gaming section or a lot of other publications that straddle other types of readers also getting into games. Yep. And so it's funny because, that from there, just as like my time at Rolling Stone led to getting hired at The Onion, indirectly, my time writing about games at The Onion indirectly led to my then going on writing about games for Wired or going to write for all the websites that are now gone, like GamePro or magazines like EGM and Joystick and Games Radar and just on and on. I mean, there was a point. There was a point where, because sort of the constricting that I was talking about in journalism, it sort of like circled the drain last to video game writing, and sort of the circles I was in. Like it hit just general entertainment journalism at the time when I was at The Onion, and then like years later, when I was full-time freelance, I was like warning everyone in games. I was like, hey, things are about to get really bad. And everyone was like, nah, it'll be fine. We're going to be okay. And so it just, I guess, I feel like in a weird way, this is your life kind of thing. I'm trying to like see themes that have popped up and as I'm trying to make sense of it myself. Mm-hmm. It just came out of like, and I don't know if I can really remember directly like why I wanted to write about games other than, I guess just like the typical thing that attracts most people to wanting to write about games, at least initially, which is like, hey, it would be kind of neat to just get stuff I'm interested in for free and then to weigh in as a critic. And then, I have a lot of thoughts about criticism and its role and critics and their role, and all that is a lot of stuff that's been deeply affected by the internet as well, of course. So that's there you go. I braided it all together.
I think video games also, like a lot of people look at video games critically, in part, because they're interested in it. But I also think like some amount of it comes from just the fact it's not as young as it used to be. Obviously, it's getting older, but it's still not as old as other mediums out there. And so there's so much more room for audiences as well as critics to, like I was talking to my friend about this, to grow in what we understand about them. We are getting better and better at that, I think. I think that's one of the few things that, it's taking time, but we are more collectively kind of becoming aware of, these things are okay, or, what we should be expecting out of them. My next question kind of has a bit of an introduction to it. It shouldn't be too long, though. Have you ever heard of the marketing perspective?
I guess not, but I know what all those words mean.
So my capstone course, we had a lot of supplemental material that we got to read, different Harvard Business Review articles, things like that. One of which was, I think, a segment from a book called The Marketing Perspective.
Okay.
And the segment breaks down how it evolved and came about, which is from the 1850s to 1900, there was the production orientation perspective, which is that you build it, people show up and buy it, because people weren't traveling all around the world, and there was, only one or two places you go for specific products that you needed. And so you didn't really have to think about selling it to the person. All you had to do was think about making sure it was made or it was present and available. And then from the 1900s to the 1950s, suddenly that wasn't the case anymore. There was more than one car supplier, for example.
Right.
And so you had to get sales oriented. You had to get salespeople. You had to get people to convince them that your product was better and that it was one that they wanted. And it's kind of funny, for a while, from the 1950s up to the millennium, sales perspective still kind of exists, even today in ways. But the book made the case that essentially the marketing perspective is the new breed. And this is an article from the 90s, I want to say.
Yeah. Which
is the idea that you were somebody who was around when marketing was growing and morphing and adapting. So
it's one of my proudest accomplishments.
one of the best examples of the marketing perspective in its earlier heydays is the idea of trying to market cigarettes, right? Trying to make that cool back when it was there was a brand where their motto was, "We're gonna get you," and it's just wait a second, right? That was the marketing perspective, is trying to convince people that you need the thing that they are selling. It's not even about like, this is for you, the sales orientation. It's about you need this. And in the millennium, we're seeing kind of this hyper marketing perspective where, at least in America, I know it's different in different countries, but at least in America, the market, like the reason these things come about are because like consumers have options, and also because consumers, we become aware of the fact that they are trying to get us to buy in, right? So we're aware of this interplay, and so the upping the ante from the marketing perspective is almost this hyper thing in America, where it's everything isn't just about like, oh, you're cool now. It's like, no, this is sexual. We're gonna make a cheeseburger sexual. We're gonna make it amazing, right? And that's still not working anymore. I just really don't think it is. And what's really coming about, which isn't in this book at all, but I think it's the idea of a brand perspective. It's not about marketing. It's about you being rewarded for being in on the thing now. Yeah. And I bring all this up because I went through like all of our emails and just went through all of our conversations to see if there's anything that would come out of it. Yeah. One of which was, you talked about how media writing went from this thing where like the editorial was the product, and now and then you said it changed at a point to where the writer is the product now. Oh, and so interesting. I'm reflecting on that. I wondered if like the marketing perspective or the brand perspective, especially, unless you're a sole author like Stephen King, if like those perspectives are something that are completely inapplicable to being a writer, like just doesn't work. Yeah. And that's what I was wondering. Like I was wondering what your thoughts on that were. Like if that's something that just doesn't work at all.
What specifically is your question? I mean, I could react in general to all that, but it's fine.
Do you think like the marketing perspective or branded perspective is something that just doesn't work if you're a writer for you? If it doesn't
I mean, that's the other thing, is I can only speak for me, and I think that I'm atypical in a number of ways. I mean, I guess you could have had a way of knowing this. I neglected to mention this. During that period of time you were talking about, my dad actually wrote a book about the AMA, the American Medical Association, being in bed with big tobacco. And so I grew up being exposed to
all of that.
to an awareness of you can't really trust everything that you hear, everything that you read. And it's just funny because you mentioned that at a time where I'm reading this book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism right now, which is like, so when you say the word hyper in this context and you say that like consumers have options. So this book is all about like, and we'll see if I can connect this to writing, and hopefully I can. This book is talking about the rise of social media companies and tech companies, how they sort of exploited national sentiment and current events to basically, there was a saying, there was an expression which I'm sure you've heard, which is like, if you're not paying for a service, then you are the product. I don't know if you've heard that before. But this book actually further makes a distinction that you are actually not the product, but the raw material from which the product is derived. So it's basically like, it's like when you say consumers have options, I immediately wonder like, well, do we really have options? When we have a lot of products that are sold to us where you basically like can't unlock their core functionality unless you agree to have all your data harvested. And it's hard to talk about this stuff without
sounding... On the internet, it's different.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk about this stuff without seeming like a paranoid weirdo.
Nothing is really like shot down paranoid weirdoism when it comes to like security on the internet, though.
But I think it connects where it's like, like when it comes to I think it's just like it's a void that will be filled by someone. This sort of phenomenon of a personality as the go-to whatever on whatever topic. It can be video games. It can be breath mints, it could be tennis, it could be any field. Just because most people don't have the time or the interest to sort of seek out alternative opinions or viewpoints, and I don't even say that with any without any regard to like a political spectrum. It's just like, what are other approaches to reading about this? It's like, even like you were saying, like in the 3 years since we last spoke, with the tables reversed the other way, chances are like you and I could sit down and talk about like every place we have gone to read about video games on the internet or offline, and I guarantee you, like, we may have fewer overlaps just because of how many there are. And I think about this a lot, and I don't know that I've ever actually said it outside of my brain, but I actually think like you can focus on, okay, these are all horrible things and they shouldn't be this way. Like, it shouldn't be that like big tobacco is like collaborating with organizations that are supposed to have our well-being in mind. But at the same point, like, I think of it almost as like a strange rubber band where that creates a tension in a certain direction, but then there will always be people just out in the general public or general workforce who will they'll wonder about that, or they'll wonder about assertions being made, and will start pulling in other directions and start looking at other ways to look at it. So it's almost like, because I think that what's sort of being not mentioned or what's being implied here is like, if there are big personalities, that somehow that's bad. Like it's bad in my life and it's bad in my friends' lives, because it means it's harder to get editors' attention, it's harder to get paid to do work, and it's bad for readers because they get fewer perspectives and they get, I mean, that is bad. that in and of itself is bad. And I think in the last few years, there have been a couple of big upheavals in big entertainment industries elsewhere, where we've sort of seen the things that have been held back, or we've seen the things that people didn't want to have be seen, and I guess I'm referring here to Me Too, and there have been, other things, and there's other reasons for that, but now I just feel like I'm getting into word soup here. But what was your original question? So, like,
think about those publications for video games, right? Think about PC Gamer, think about Joystick, Kotaku, whatever.
Yeah.
And like, all I could think about is the idea that like, what's really like both what is really rewarding about being a fan of a publication, like that, and like how that doesn't. I can't think of too many ways in which a writer can be bigger than that, unless like you're some multi-million selling author. Like, in terms of brand almost is this like non-dying thing. And so like, I'm wondering if like in the writing space that like, it's just, you can't do that. Like, there's nothing really really holding us to writing brands, be it one author or be it like a publication. It's kind of hard to do that.
I think it's I'm picturing like an inverted pyramid, which is sort of the way journalists are supposed to approach stories, or at one point that was, where I think like there's brands, or like I'm using brand, and in my mind I'm like thinking of it as a synonym to like a person with a legacy, or a person who carries a great deal of influence. I think it's like there are sort of those heavyweights in all strata of all things. It's like, so like, look at video games, right? And so these are none of these are going to be household names, but I guarantee you most people listening to this will probably know these names. And so it's just weird, because like, I've been around for a while, which is a thing that both is true and also is very vague. Because there are other people who have been, but there are also people who have been around even longer than me, and I think, because like I think I mentioned to you, like, I'll hear from people a lot of the times, and they'll have a specific question for me about a specific article by a specific person at a specific place, and I think there's this mistaken perception that like all of us who write about video games all hang out in some like break room together.
You're all reading each other's articles all the time.
Yeah, and I think for some people that is true, but I think for a lot of people that's not true. And I think it's just weird because I guess like the brand intersection is like there are readers who will only read certain writers because they are that writer. Like I'm flashing back on like it's just weird. I don't think I think that's a certain personality type that would react and say, "Oh, that's weird." Like there was an interview I did with Ryan Kuo, who I don't remember if he ever directly edited me at Kill Screen. This would have been around the Onion days. He told me when I interviewed him for this that at one point, like, he had seen people talking about online, like, oh, when is the next Ryan Kuo when is the next Ryan Kuo review of whatever game going to be posted? And they can't wait, and they're so eager to read it. And he told me that he thought that was weird. And I would think that's weird. But there are some people who are... I mean, my go-to word was going to be self-important. Like, there are some people who think their opinion is actually that important. And I think, like, the other vector in all this is social media. And I think there's a great mistake in, like, just because a lot of people listen to you doesn't mean you have anything that interesting to say or anything all that important to say. Like, it's become this weird metric where, like, I thought we all sort of left high school understanding the most popular people don't have the best things to say or should be listened to all the time.
They're just popular. That's it.
What's that?
They're just popular.
Yeah, they're just. I mean, but I mean, you can't really talk about any of this stuff because it tends to sound like sour grapes or some sort of jealousy. But my point is, like, I think that, like, so there's like me and whoever else you or other people may feel are my contemporaries. And I if you've been following these interviews, like, I talked to Mike Thompson, who he and I have never met, but he told me, like, he considers, like, oh, we're from the same cohort. And what that means is, like, we were writers at the same time about the same stuff at a time when there were just a handful of other writers who tended to write a lot about this stuff. And I could tell you other people who were our contemporaries, but a lot of those people have just moved on from writing because it's hard to do, or they have had other life stuff happen and they had to stop. But, like, all this stuff is a bit of a revolving door. And me and Mike and whoever else, we take the place of whoever was in our spot in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. But, there's a certain level that we're all at. And I guess you can call that a brand or whatever, a certain, like, branded value or something. And then there's people below that who, like, I used to always get comments on things at the Onion AV Club on my reviews, and a lot of times you have people who I came to realize, like, oh, they just want my job. They just want to, because they imagine that, like, I'm fabulously rich reviewing Super Mario Galaxy on the Wii, that I'm just getting tons of money and it's very glamorous. And I totally understand that. I understand the luck and the fun that's involved with, like, rendering your opinion of an entertainment product and getting paid to do it. Although I was doing all that stuff voluntarily. So there's sort of, I want to walk back calling it an inverted pyramid. I think they're just all, like, it's like a bucket of crabs is sort of the way I've heard culture described, where there really is no top or bottom because one is linked to the other. And if one person tries to get out into another spot, it's sort of like how I got that job at the Onion, like I mentioned, like a position was created at the top, and but like there's, like, I don't even really like using the word blog or bloggers, but, like, that would be the point, sort of below people who are on salary getting paid to write. And then there's a certain strata above where people like I am or I was. And in the game space, I don't know if this answers your question, but, like, it tends to be like you reach just a certain point because there's so many jobs in writing about games where unless you have that particular disease and you just are driven and that's all you really want to do, you can do that. But above that, like, what tends to happen for people who specialize in that space is they'll wind up in PR. They love games so much that they want to use their writing talent to help promote games more directly. Or there's, like, people who want to literally write games, and that's an even smaller strata. And then there are people, I guess I'm really struggling to think of other people who are like Geoff Keighley. Because he has transcended in a number of ways, and I think a lot of people look at him as sort of like a goofy cheerleader for video games. A little bit of both, yeah. And I think that's true, but I think that's just sort of
I think a lot of people think he's earnest for what he wants to do.
Well, he's Canadian, so so that's just sort of the perception there.
No one really kind of doubts his what he's trying to do.
Well, but the thing is, if you go back and look at some of the stuff he has written, this predates me. He's a very talented writer who got a lot of really great stories. He had really good connections. He was able to write really interesting stories, and they were well written. And I mentioned there weren't really that many places to write about games when I was writing about them, salaried or otherwise, for other publications. It was even less so, in the time before, quote unquote, my time.
If I remember right, he got a very, very big exclusive look at Valve right before they launched Half-Life 1, and he just kept doing that every time they launched a major single-player product. He got to work with them closely at the studio not long before the game would ship.
Oh, the story I was thinking of, one that always comes to mind, is he did this in-depth breakdown of Daikatana, the John Romero game after. Yep. Yeah, he did this story. It's worth looking up about just what the heck happened. Sort of how it's worth seeking out. Sure. But I don't really know what the strata is above him. But I think this is just, I guess in a way we're talking about celebrity, and I think
if you're pushing brand on video game writing, it turns into celebrity because it's typically one person.
And I guess none of this even includes the whole streamer sphere, which I guess is another place writers can wind up as well.
Yes, I think so too. My experience with that is normally not. I don't look at the writers in the stream spectrum, but I wouldn't be surprised if they turn into that or move towards that.
There are some that I've seen that are trying to quote unquote diversify. My
friend was talking to me about that. Some people who worked for some various media outlets wound up starting kind of their own.
Oh
things. Yeah. I can't remember their names, but they're out there.
They're on Patreon.
Yeah, a lot of this came out of just the reality that we live in a world that is very much using brands today. Sequels are pretty much in film space and video games. They're pretty much a presumed thing so long as the money is there when the first one comes out. As long as the first one's successful, everyone assumes there's a sequel now. Tie-ins are essential for media. Brand never dies, or it's something very strong that doesn't die so easily. And so I was thinking about writing, and it's just if the way writing decayed for journalism, is if writing's been around longer than all of these things, and I was wondering that if writing was a way of looking at the early signs of what will happen next with the things that are younger and able to use the brand perspective to live forever,